Professor Oded Lipschits from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part E. The Untold Story about the Kingdom of Judah in the days of the biblical historiographers. Chapter 4. The Untold Story of the Temple of Solomon at Tel Moza. The accidental and exciting discovery of a temple that existed and operated throughout the First Temple period at a distance of merely 7 kilometers from Jerusalem allows a unique glimpse, at least for now, into how temples operated and developed in the first millennium BCE, the same time when the temple discussed in the biblical description operated in the kingdom of Judah's capital. Tracking the processes of change and development in the temple at Moza over its centuries of activity provides a potential archaeological point of comparison to the development processes of the temple in Jerusalem, about which we have information only from the biblical descriptions. Moreover, the archaeological research of the Moza Temple also allows us to explore the relationship between the two communities surrounding the two temples. The community that lived in the Moza Valley, for whom the temple in Moza was the central place of cult, and the neighboring community which lived in Jerusalem and its immediate surrounding, for whom the Temple of Solomon built at the top of the Temple Mount was the central place of cult. Despite the biblical historiographers' complete disregard from the temple in Moza, through archaeological research, we can try to answer some critical questions. How did the Jerusalem elite treat the temple in Moza, and how did the elite in Moza treat the temple in Jerusalem? Since when, if at all, was the community living in the Moza Valley obligated to the temple in Jerusalem and its local rulers, the kings of the house of David? Since when, if at all, did people from the Moza community start making pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem and considering it the king's temple, making it a meaningful site from them as well? When they went up to Jerusalem, did they do it because they were obligated to do so as inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah under the rule of the house of David in Jerusalem, whose temple was built there? Or rather, did they go with the intention and desire to worship the God of this temple in Jerusalem? And was the God of the temple at Moza the same God as the one of the temple in Jerusalem throughout the duration of the existence of the two temples? Not all of these questions have an answer, certainly not in the short discussion that I will present in this chapter. Notably, however, the significance of the question about the development of the relationships between these two communities of the Moza Valley and of Jerusalem extends much beyond this local inquiry. Indeed, its answer requires a much wider understanding of the formation process of the kingdom of Judah from the core of the kingdom of Jerusalem in the late Bronze Age to the relatively extensive territorial kingdom of the 8th century BCE, encompassing the entire area between the Beersheba-Arad Valley in the south, the lowland in the west, and the Benjamin Valley in the north. Was the Moza Valley part of the agricultural territory of the kingdom of Jerusalem for centuries, or was it a separate clan with separate rulers and a separate cultic system, which was integrated in a gradual process within the Judean system that developed from its center in Jerusalem? In the later, how did this process come to be, and how gradual was it? Since when can the temple and the tribe in the Moza Valley be considered a part of Judah? The untold story of the Moza Temple is a special chapter in this podcast since, as has been shown many times, part of the basic ideology of the biblical historiographer was to acknowledge the existence of other places of cult to the God of Israel, but to oppose their legitimacy. As mentioned, the Deuteronomist's basic requirement, in accordance with the law of the book of Deuteronomy, was to concentrate the cult in one place, that is, the place that God has chosen. Accordingly, the theological evaluation formulae in the book of Kings define the sinful kings as those in whose days foreign cult prevailed in Judah, and the righteous kings like Hezekiah and Josiah as who did what was good in the eyes of God and concentrated the cult in Jerusalem, in this one temple. All the other kings were said to have done what was right in the eyes of God, because the historiographer's view is that in their day foreign cult did not prevail and therefore they were not sinners. However, the historiographers admit that all these kings didn't yet know about the laws of the book of Deuteronomy and the need to concentrate the cult to the God of Israel in Jerusalem, and therefore could not be recognized as righteous kings. Thus, their theological assessment formula states, according to that they did what is right in the eyes of Yahweh, but qualifies that with the statement that, and I'm quoting, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. End of quote. This description, acknowledging that the high places had not been removed and the people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, is written from the perspective that is aware that, at least until Josiah's cultic reform, there were many other places in Judah besides Jerusalem where cult of the God of Israel continued. This, from the Deuteronomist perspective, is because the book had not yet been found, and the law that orders the concentration of cult in Jerusalem had not yet been written. Hence, the untold story of the Moza Temple is one of those special, ideologically based omissions based on the author's perspective. The temple's omission in itself is the message, although, in all likelihood, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem and its surroundings, and perhaps also a broader population throughout Judah, knew this temple, passed by it on the way to Jerusalem, and had perhaps even visited it. After we get to know the temple and discuss the history of its unveiling, its plan, and what makes it unique, I will suggest, perhaps to your surprise, that the biblical historiographer actually couldn't really omit this special temple in Moza, which was so central, important, and close to Jerusalem. Therefore, it is actually mentioned in the biblical story, even quite centrally. But first, let's get to know the temple and its history. Tel Moza is located about 7 kilometers northwest of Jerusalem on the lower third of a ridge that descends from south from the hill above it, where the modern-day town of Mevaseret Zion is located. The site lies along the ancient route of the road connecting the lowlands to the west and the central hill country, where today's highway number 1 passes between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Researchers commonly identify the place with the one of the cities in the Benjamin inheritance mentioned only in Joshua 18 verse 26 as Hamotza, but not mentioned elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Several springs flow at the foot of the hill and in the valley below. The soil is fertile, allowing for intensive agricultural activity, including grain cultivation. These resources, a combination of water and a wide valley with fertile soil, are very rare in the hill country. Therefore, people settled there since prehistoric times, and it has been continuously inhabited throughout the present. From the archaeological excavations and surveys in the Tell and its surroundings, it appeared that there was a large settlement at Moza as early as the Neolithic period, and this continued to be the case in the Iron Age and the Roman period, when a settlement established by a Roman emperor, Vespasian, for the veterans of the 10th Legion at the foot of the hill, following the conquest of Jerusalem in the 1st century CE, and the name of the place was changed to Colonia. In the Middle Ages, the Crusaders' colony existed at the foot of the hill, and in recent centuries, the Arab village of Calunia extended over the entire ridge and the valley at its feet. An important and special source of information about this place is found in the Moza stamp impressions on the handles of storage jars of a type that continued the previous Lamelech and Rosette stamp impressions, but whose lower part is slightly wider and which begins to make on the sack shape characteristic of jars of the Babylonian and Persian periods. These jars were produced from the local Moza clay, and they have been commonly dated to the 6th century BCE, the period after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, and seen as evidence of the existence of the jar administration in Judah during the Babylonian rule in Judah. There are very few Moza stamp impressions on jar handles, 40-something on jar handles and 3 on the side of the jars, 30 of which were found in Tel Enatzbe, which is identified with the biblical Mitzpah, the capital of Judah, after the destruction of Jerusalem, where Gedaliah the son of Ahikam sat. All the stamp impressions appear with the he at the end in 3 or 4 letters, with or without the vav after the initial mem, in one line or divided into 2 lines, and in the official Aramaic script. Notably, this use of Aramaic script was a sharp change from the exclusive use of Hebrew on bully and stamp impressions from the First Temple period. The system of stamp impressions seems to have been used for a very short period of time in the 6th century BCE and didn't continue in the Persian period. To this, one should add the information on one incised inscription named Hamoza Shu'al, appearing on a storage jar handle acquired from the antiquities market. The name Hamoza is spelled here with hey at the end and with a definite article, exactly like it was written in Joshua chapter 18 verse 26, indicating that the initial he was an integral part of the name in pre-exilic times, very similar to Hamitzpah, the name of the capital in the 6th century BC. Many researchers consider the Moza stamp impressions and the jars on which the seals were stamped on as evidence of the existence of a royal estate which supplied produce to the governor who lived in Mitzpah, the capital of the province of Judah, during the Babylonian period. This assumption also explains why most of the stamped jar handles were found in this place, Mitzpah, and their distribution is limited to the very small area north of Jerusalem, with only one stamp impression to the south of Jerusalem found in Ramat Rachel. Moreover, we can assume that the place became a royal estate beginning with the Babylonian occupation and the destruction of Jerusalem. Since it is commonly assumed that such royal estates existed in the land of Israel for hundreds of years, even after the imperial ruler changed, perhaps this status held by Moza as early as the days of the Babylonian rule is what led to its transformation into a settlement place for the veterans of the 10th Legion in the district of Emmaus, located 30 stadia, about 5.6 kilometers from Jerusalem, according to Josephus in his book War of the Jews, chapter 6, verse 6. Indeed, Moza's existence as a royal estate was the basis for several traditions about the place, which were preserved for hundreds of years. In the Mishnah, in Mishnah Sukkah 4:5, it is said, "How is the commandment of the willow branch fulfilled? There was a place below Jerusalem, and it was called Moza. They would go down there and gather branches of willow from there, and come to prop them standing up against the altar in the temple, and their tops would lean over the altar." In the Jerusalem Talmud, in Sukkah 18b, Moza was identified with Colonia, the Roman Colonia. They said, "What is Moza? Memetzia," said Rabbi Tanchuma. "Colonia was its name." And according to the Babylonian Talmud 45a, we have learned, and I'm quoting, "We have learned the place was actually called Colonia." And the author of our Mishnah, why then did he call it Moza? Since it was exempt for the royal tax, it was called Moza, it means taking out, Moza. This is also how the commentator Rashi explains in this vein, Colonia, Ben Chorin, a free man, from the king's tax. In light of the plan to change the route of Highway 1 on the way to Jerusalem, the Israel Antiquities Authority conducted a series of salvage excavations in the area, which spanned over 20 years between 1993 and 2013, during which a site was uncovered with settlements ranging from the Neolithic period all the way through the 20th century. The excavation revealed that the peak of the settlement and the site was during the Iron Age II, between the 10th and 6th century BCE, when it was a regional administrative and cultic center. At the end of the excavations, and for the entire period of the construction and paving of Highway number 1 in this area, the entire complex was covered with sand. At the end of the construction in 2018-19, the cover was removed, and the Israel Antiquities Authority was allowed to preserve and restore the remains that were excavated in the salvage excavations. However, beginning in 2019, excavation initiated by Tel Aviv University began at the site to reveal the cultic complex and its surroundings, and to understand the stages of development at the site as an economic and cultic center during the various eras of the Iron Age. The main picture clarified by the excavation is that already in the late Iron Age I and early Iron Age II, I'm talking about 11th, 10th centuries BCE, large silos were dug in the northern part of the complex, and a small temple was built in its center, the plan and size of which remain unknown. During the early Iron Age IIa, the late 10th and early 9th century BCE, a large new temple was built in the center of the area, which covered the ancient temple and was built over part of the silos. Many silos, warehouses, buildings, and other buildings were found next to it. This is a monumental temple that follows the typical in antis North Syrian architectural plan employed in monumental temples as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, and comparable to North Syrian Iron Age temples, for example in Tel Ta'anayat, in Dara, and to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, as it is described in the biblical text in the first book of Kings, chapter 6 and 7, and we can compare it to 2 Chronicles chapter 3. The temple at Moza was built on an east-west orientation and consists of a courtyard and a large rectangular building segmented into two spaces. A smaller inner shrine, maybe Holy of Holies, located at the back, where the central object of worship, often a statue or a standing stone, was placed, and a larger forward chamber connected to it by a front portico with two columns flanking the entrance. Benches were found along the walls of the forward chamber, on which offerings and tombstones were placed. 5 fieldstones, probably serving as standing stone, matzevot, were set on the plaster floor against the northern bench. The entrance to the temple is from the east between the two pillars, while beyond it was a large courtyard where many of the worship ceremonies were held. A stone-built altar stands at the center of the courtyard, directly in front of the temple's entrance. To the northeast, nearly adjacent to the altar, is an oval pit about 1 meter deep, dug into the packed earth floor. It was filled with earth, ash, pottery sherds, and very large amount of bones, mostly of sheep and goat, some burned and some with butchery marks. The pit probably functioned as a repository pit for the disposal of remains associated with the sacrifices performed on the altar. A stone-built offering table was located about 1 meter to the north of the pit, and an assemblage of cult artifacts and vessels was found deposited within the narrow strip of the courtyard floor between the offering table and the repository pit. Presumably, some of these vessels were originally placed on the offering table. The cultic assemblages included many bowls, chalices, stands, jars, and juglets, as well as special artifacts such as 4 figurines, 2 anthropomorphic and 2 zoomorphic, fragments of a large cult stand decorated with a pair of sphinxes or lions formed in low relief, and pendants, one shaped like a pomegranate. This phase of the temple is well dated to the Iron Age 2A. However, the temple continued to develop during the Iron Age 2B and C, from the late 10th, early 9th to the late 7th, early 6th century BCE, and at least 4 phases were discerned in the temple courtyard, though it is not clear whether the structure continued to function as a temple through the end of this period. It seems that these phases reflect the continuous function of the temple throughout the Iron Age II, with the intentional deposition likely performed as part of a religious ritual during which cultic paraphernalia were decommissioned to make room for new artifacts, an act of reverence rather than signifying a break in religious traditions. In the last phase, which dates to the Iron Age to C, a large building was built south of the temple adjacent to its walls. No layers of construction were discovered in the temple itself from this period. Therefore, from an archaeological perspective, it is unclear until what period it continued to exist, and if the building, which stood until the Persian period, continued to function as a temple even at that stage. Quite likely, the agricultural population served by the cultic and administrative economic complex lived in small villages and farms in the Moza Valley and its surroundings, in sites that only few of them are known to the archaeological research. In addition, it is important to know that most of the buildings and installations discovered in the area close to the cultic complex were used to store grain, service, and industrial. Part of 3 buildings were found there, dating to the Iron Age to C, and it is clear that the excavated area served as an economic, administrative, and cultic center and was not a residential site. We might assume that the residence area of the local elite was on the terrace above the temple, which has not yet been excavated, or in the area further from the temple, which also has not been explored and may never be found because of the buildings of the Arab village of Kalunia that were strewn throughout the area, many of which were based on the bedrock of the hilly slope. In their construction, ancient remains were cleared and the terraces built flattened the slope into wide steps. The Moza Temple seemed to be a good example of the connection between economy, administration, and cult. The many silos that existed throughout the temple's existence at the site, the ancient small one and the large one that was built over it and over some of the silos, provide evidence that the site functioned as an administrative and economic center before it also became a cultic center. The establishment of a cultic complex with a monumental temple in its center, which replaced the smaller cultic structure used in the Iron Age 2A, and the existence of dozens of silos next to it in the Iron Age 2B, alongside the storage, service, and industrial buildings that were erected next to the temple, all testify to the economic growth that took place throughout the existence of the temple, and also point to increased industrialization of the area and the site, its role in the regional administration, and its function as a center of produce, storage, and distribution to all the people in the valley. This is evidence of the site's growing empowerment and status, proving also the economic abundance in the area throughout the period when construction of cultic buildings on the site and the cult held in them were a natural development and another expression of the prosperity and the important economic status of the site for its immediate surroundings. The connection between cults and the economy is well known in the ancient Near East and is a clear expression of the second stage in the development of local centers. Thus, after the first stage of the formation of local elites, religious elites also developed, which strengthened and tightened the grip on the space around them through establishing local cult, connecting the population to the cultic center, and the creating affinity between the economy and cult, what some scholars call sacred economy or industrial cult. Since cult places and temples existed in the Iron Age too, in accordance with accepted religious conventions that prevailed throughout much of the ancient Near East, and as part of the local political structure, it is fascinating to see how even in a relatively small and isolated place, the local rulers knew as early as the end of the 10th and early 9th centuries BCE how a temple should look and what should be included in a cultic complex. The rulers who based their power on a tribal unit that lived in the Moza Valley, which was likely comprised of no more than 200 households, a population size similar to the contemporaneous one in Jerusalem in this time, had the financial ability to appoint priests who knew how the cult should be conducted, to manage the temple and sustain the priesthood that ran it, and to make the population under their control maintain the temple and turn it into the regional cultic center. Given this understanding of the development process at the Moza Temple, the historical reconstruction by the site's excavators is that the economic industrial center in the place belonged to an elite which gained its power from the local population of the Moza Valley. This elite initially represented a few dozen households or perhaps a few farms and villages located around the valley that joined together under the same leadership to pool their resources and maximize production and agricultural output. The construction of the small cultic structure, followed by the construction of the monumental temple and the expansion of the site, reflect demographic and economic growth alongside the continued development of the social hierarchy. The cultic and industrial complex reflects the complexity of the local community and testifies to the level of administrative and economic consolidation of the communities that lived in the Moza Valley area already in the early 9th century BCE. A similar process took place at exactly the same time in nearby Jerusalem. According to the biblical description, because this is what we have, the local elite connected to the house of David established itself there in the first stage, expanding its power base amongst the city residents and apparently also on its immediate surroundings, turning Jerusalem into the administrative capital, the ruling center of the city and its surrounding communities. Only in the second phase was the temple built by Solomon, the second generation of kings from the house of David. This added another layer designed to tighter Davidic rule, to add the dimension of cult to the rule of the royal house, and to unite the population around the sacred center. Later, the temple was also used as a tool to expand Davidic rule to circles further away from the city. Unlike Moza, which was a cultic economic and administrative center that developed around the late 10th and early 9th century BCE, Jerusalem was already a fortified urban center in the central hill country almost 1,000 years earlier, where monumental construction existed, an indication for a local elite that ruled in the area around it. Jerusalem is also mentioned in ancient texts such as the El Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE as an urban center that controls large areas in the center of the hill country. We can assume that for long periods in the second millennium BCE, the rulers of Jerusalem controlled a vast area, including the Benjamin region in the north, Bethlehem and the Rephaim Valley in the south, up to the area controlled by the lowland cities in the west. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that, at least in parts of this period, the Moza Valley was included within the Kingdom of Jerusalem's domain of control. For this reason, the Moza Temple excavations play an important role in reconstructing the development processes of the Kingdom of Judah in the first millennium BCE, when the rulers of the house of David in Jerusalem restored their control over the areas that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had controlled in centuries prior, which we can identify based on the letters from the El Amarna archive. Based on the archaeological findings, researchers assume that in its early days, the Kingdom of Judah included local elites from Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings who were related by kingship bonds. The powerful, centralized kingdom with a vast territory that ruled from Jerusalem did not develop before the late 9th and early 8th century BCE. As discussed in some of the previous chapters, it seems reasonable to assume that Judah's expansion into the lowlands didn't occur before the destruction of the city of Gath by King Hazael of Aram Damascus toward the end of the 9th century BCE, and as long as the kingdom of Israel was large and strong, especially during the days of the Omri dynasty, the development of Judah as an advanced, large, and independent kingdom was limited. In any case, the expansion of Jerusalem's control towards the very close by Moza Valley must have been preceded by the expansion of Judah into the wider and more distant circle of the lowlands and the Beersheba Arad Valley. Therefore, based on historical consideration alone, we can assume that it took place during the 9th century BCE, about 2 or 3 generations after the establishment and consolidation of the Moza Temple, simultaneously to the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem. After the establishment of the local elite in Moza, concurrently with the establishment of the House of David in Jerusalem, and after the consolidation of the Moza Valley population under the leadership of the local elite, concurrent with the consolidation of power in Jerusalem and its immediate vicinity under the leadership of the House of David. In this point of the discussion, I would like to suggest that perhaps the biblical historiographer didn't completely ignore the Moza Temple, which was well known to everyone who lived in the area. The identification of the archaeological site of Tel Moza with Moza with Aleph at the end of the word, that is mentioned 5 times as a personal name in the genealogical lists detailed in the first book of Chronicles, especially in chapter 2 and 9, and never as a name of a place, or with a place name Hamoza, written with he at the end of the word, that is mentioned once in the book of Joshua, chapter 18, verse 26, as a place on the border between the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, is not entirely unambiguous. The association between modern-day Tel Moza and the biblical site of Hamoza is based on the preservation of the name of 2 sites, Khirbet Miza, in the valley below Kalunia and nearby Khirbet Mitza, above Ein HaMevaser, the spring, that is on the ridge above the valley. It is also based on the preservation of the name of the Arab village of Kalunia that existed until 1948 on the slope of the hill and extended into the valley below, preserving the medieval name Kaluni, which in turn preserved the name of the Roman Colonia. Though some scholars initially identified the biblical site with Khirbet Bet Miza, located at the top of the slope, above the Ein HaMevaser spring, the identification of biblical Moza with the village of Kalunia in Khirbet Miza, first suggested by Vincent and Abel in 1932, got a lot of support with the revelation of the multi-phased Iron Age remains at the site, which became commonly accepted by most scholars. As against this accepted view, in my opinion, it is possible that the name Hamoza, mentioned in the book of Joshua once, referred to the valley at the bottom of the hill, hence its name Hamoza, meaning exhaust, to squeeze, reflects agricultural activity of processing agricultural produce, and compare, for example, to another valley that was mentioned in the same chapter in the book of Joshua in verse 21, the valley of Ketzitz, meaning the place of cutting, chopping, again, agricultural work. In the biblical text, there is no connection between the geographical name Hamoza, with He at the end, and the personal name Moza, with Aleph at the end, unless this is a very late from the Persian period, because it's the book of Chronicles. It's a wordplay on the name of the valley and the main spring in the valley, probably a spring known in our days as Ein HaMevaser, located a little bit below the small ancient site called Khirbet Bet Miza, which probably preserved the ancient name of Moza. The meaning of this name is the outlet of the water into the stream or the outlet of the spring. Very similar to the name of the spring in Jerusalem, Gihon, Hagihon, which bears the same meaning, the outlet of the spring where the water comes out. Images parallel to a burst of water coming out of the ground are also mentioned as Mabua, Mabu'e Mayim, and we can find it in the other biblical places, or as Peretz Mayim, as places the water flow out. Therefore, I would like to suggest that Moza, with he at the end, was the name of the royal estate that existed in the Moza Valley below the current site that got the name Tel Moza, and that this royal estate was established at the end of the 8th century BCE and existed since then for hundreds of years. Like other royal estates, and Gedi is the best example, this legal status of the land in the valley was the base for the establishment of Roman colonia by Vespasian for the veterans of the 10th Legion. The key to this reconstruction lies in the analysis of the Moza stamp impressions on the handles of storage jars and understanding the place of this system within the entire 600 years of administration of the storage jars. The Moza stamp impression system is unusual in the paucity of handles uncovered, in their limited distribution, in the very small number of seals presumably used, in its short duration of use, and in the concentration of most stamped handles in one place, Tel Enatzbe, Mitzpah, that was the capital of Judah during the exilic period, 6th century BCE. Probably like the private stamp impression that preceded it for 100 years and the Yerushalayim system that came hundreds of years later. It was one of the ad hoc systems of stamped jar handles, evidence of a royal estate that supplied produce to the governor residing in Mitzpah just after the destruction of Jerusalem. Given all the system's characteristics and on the basis of this understanding of the name Moza, I would like to suggest that the system of Moza stamp impressions function as a temporary ad hoc system in order to bring agricultural supplies to the Babylonian governor residing in Mitzpah, perhaps in the province's early days before the system had become well established as for a certain period in the 6th century BCE when Judah was a Babylonian province. Compared to the paucity of mentions of Moza in the biblical descriptions and the difficult problems with these mentions, a place called Kiryat-Yearim is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible 18 times as a place on the border between Judah and Benjamin. In Joshua 15, verse 9, the place has another name, Baalah, from the name Baal, and I can quote, "Then the boundary bends round to Baalah, that is Kiryat-Yearim," end of quote. And according to Joshua chapter 15, verse 60, and chapter 18, verse 14, the name of this place was also Kiryat Baal. And I can quote, Kiryat Baal, that is Kiryat-Yearim. It might be that the name of the place, Baalei Yehuda, Baalei of Judah, as mentioned in the second book of Samuel, chapter 6, verse 2, was disrupted, but in any case, also in this place, Baal is a central component of the name of this place. Kiryat-Yearim is defined once in Joshua 9, verse 17, as one of the Gibeonite cities, and I can quote, "And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now the cities were Gibeon, Kephirah, Be'erot, and Kiryat-Yearim." Moreover, it is important to the story of the wandering of the Ark that was brought to Kiryat-Yearim from Bet Shemesh, where it stayed for 20 years. And you can read from the first book of Samuel, chapter 6, verse 21, and then in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiryat-Yearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of Yahweh. Come down and take it up to you." And the men of Kiryat-Yearim came and took up the ark of Yahweh and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they concentrated his son Elazar to have charge of the ark of Yahweh. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiryat-Yearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh. End of quote. We can thus assume that the place where the ark was placed within Baalah, which is Kiryat-Yearim, was on a hill, which was called the hill of Kiryat-Yearim, and Elazar, the son of Abinadab, was appointed as the priest who took care of and guarded the holy object in this temple. In my opinion, this was the founding story linked to the temple there, which should be identified in the ancient tale of Moza and with the temple that were excavated in Moza. This is not the place to discuss in detail the accepted but also very problematic identification of Kiryat-Yearim at Dir el-Azar above the village of Abu Ghosh, very close to Kiryat-Yearim, to Moza, which is mainly based on problematic Byzantine sources. Nor is this the place to base my proposal that Kiryat-Yearim should be identified in the ancient tale of Moza and with the temple at Moza. But if we accept this assumed identification, it shed a different light on the importance of the temple in the formation of Judean cult in Jerusalem and the complex history attributed to it in Jerusalem's historiography. This historiography links the temple of Baal on the one hand, perhaps a memory of the small temple that was discovered in Tel Moza, but also, on the other hand, to the Ark of the Covenant, which may in turn be linked to the story of the foundation of the great temple in Moza. The temple was considered sacred and important. Perhaps when the connections between the house of David with its Jerusalem temple and the elite of Moza began to take shape, the ark from the temple at Moza was brought to Jerusalem and became part of the cult objects, at least for a certain time. The story of how the ark was brought from the temple on the hill in Kiryat-Yearim to Jerusalem was used to base these ties between the two communities and two temples, and as an evidence of the institutionalization of the relationship between them. And I can read from the second book of Samuel, chapter 6, verses 2 to 5. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baaleh of Judah to bring up from them the ark of God, which is called by the name, even the name of Yahweh of hosts, that sit above the cherubim. And they set the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in the hill. And Uzzah and Achio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart, and they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was in the hill, with the ark of God. And Achio went before the ark, and David and all the house of Israel played before Yahweh with all manner of instrument made of fir wood, and with harps, and with psalteries, and with timbrels, and with castanets, and with cymbals. End of quote. It is possible that this story was the basis for an annual celebration where the residents of Kiryat-Yearim and the area around it came dancing and singing from Moza to Jerusalem, and in commemoration of the celebration of the raising of the ark and the connecting of the two communities. Thus, if this reconstruction and identification I have proposed here is accepted, then the biblical historiographer did not completely ignore the Moza Temple, but actually attributed great importance to it in the kingdom's formation processes and the roots of the cult in Jerusalem. According to the description in the book of Samuel, the ark was brought up to Jerusalem in the days of David, even before the temple was built and even before it was placed in the Holy of Holies of the temple that Solomon later built. From that moment, and as long as Jerusalem's temple existed, the temple of Kiryat-Yearim is vanished, and also Moza is not mentioned. The fact of their existence, despite this neglect in the Jerusalemite historiography, can be learned, for example, from the mention of a prophet from the end of the First Temple era, mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 20. I'm quoting, "There was another man who prophesied in the name of Yahweh, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, from Kiryat-Yearim. He prophesied against this city and against this land in words like those of Jeremiah." End of quote. Also in biblical descriptions from the exilic and post-exilic periods, the place was mentioned. The purpose of this omission from the biblical historiography was to deny the legitimacy of other places of cult, except for the temple in Jerusalem, from the time the Jerusalem temple was built and began to be used in the cult of God. Biblical historiographers had no possibility to mention this temple because the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Every mention of it would be a kind of admission of its legitimacy and could be viewed as approbation that it's possible to hold cult in other places. In the next chapter, we'll deal with the untold story of Sennacherib's campaign against the kingdom of Judah, conducted in 701 BCE, a campaign that was the most dramatic and significant event in the history of the kingdom of Judah until the Babylonian destruction that came 115 years later. Not only did this campaign leave behind clear and well-dated layers of destruction, and from a historical perspective, it resulted in severe damage to Judah, the exile of many residents, the destruction of the economy, and the severing of the lowland from the kingdom. Another largely unpredictable and destructive long-term effect was in the ideological, theological, and historiographical realm. The memory of the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem, which held its ground against the Assyrian army unconquered, was the seed sown. From it, the idea emerged of God's eternal promise to his chosen city, the temple, and the dynasty of kings in Jerusalem. This was the ideology that led, about a century later, to the rebellion in Babylon, as well as to the policy that resulted in the exile and the utter destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David. This is why little is told in the book of Kings about the campaign itself and its results, while the main story emphasizes the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem and the temple and the dynasty of David. It will be very interesting, and see you in the next chapter.